In Tshwane, it's understood that the African Union mediated talks around Ethiopia are still underway. They started several days ago. They involve the central Ethiopian government and the Tigray People's Liberation Front, who govern in Tigray. And from what we understand, the government of Eritrea, which has intervened on the side of the Ethiopian government. But it can be very difficult to get proper information about what's happening in these talks. Laetitia Bader is the director of the Horn of Africa for Human Rights Watch. Laetitia, good evening, good afternoon to you. Very little coming out of these talks. These are parties who, we can see from the conflict, don't really trust each other. Is there any space or optimism here that these talks could end this conflict?
Well, as you say, it has been very difficult to get information out. It became clear in the course of last week that the main topic of discussion was a potential cessation of hostilities, but more details as to what that would look like and the willingness and goodwill of warring parties to actually agree to that, there was very little information coming out. What we do know was that initially the talks were scheduled to end on Sunday, and they have continued today. We were expecting a press conference by the African Union envoy, former President Obasanjo, just in the last hour. For the moment, there's very little information that has come out, even of that. So it's difficult to know. I mean, as you say, it's not only a context in which there's been very little information coming out from the talks. We continue to struggle to get real information from the Tigray region, which is affected by this conflict itself, because of an ongoing communication ban. There's been no internet for 2 years in that region. There's no telephone communication at the moment. And as we speak, humanitarian access is currently prohibited as well. So we really don't have many ears and eyes on the ground which are able to provide information on the situation. What we do know is that despite the talks happening over the last almost 10 days now, the fighting has continued, and we continue to receive reports of abuses against civilian population there.
How would you describe the situation for civilians in Tigray? I mean, when you get cut off from the rest of the world, all kinds of things can happen.
Absolutely. I mean, what we know for certain is that the region is still besieged. There has been an effective siege on the region. There's been no services. So it's not only communication, it's also been banking, electricity, which has been cut off for over 15 months now, almost 16 months. We know that since the conflict resumed in late August, there has been no humanitarian assistance allowed in. So what is being distributed in terms of aid is aid which was already in the region. Now, what we know was that there were real difficulties for the humanitarian community even before the conflict resumed to distribute assistance, because the government was restricting the amount of fuel going in. And so humanitarians were having to make very difficult decisions about which communities they could reach to. Now, throughout this conflict, we've been particularly concerned around what is happening in rural areas, rural communities, which are very much cut off, but at the same time, it's where a lot of the fighting has happened. We do know that there has continued to be fighting in northwestern Tigray, even though the government and Eritrean forces have taken control of several towns there. We have continued to hear of fighting. This is leading to massive displacement of communities who have already repeatedly been displaced since the conflict started 2 years ago. We're starting to receive very worrying reports of sexual violence. I think it is important to underscore that in the first 8 months of the conflict, when the Eritrean and Ethiopian government forces had taken control of Tigray, we documented, and many other organizations did as well, some of the worst forms of sexual violence being committed against Tigrayan civilians there at the time. So add to this the blockade on access to medical supplies. I mean, really a very worrying situation.
Laetitia, I mean, is there anything the rest of the world should be doing? And I mean, this is one of the worst kind of conflicts, because an internal conflict brings into play all sorts of dynamics. The UN Security Council, for various reasons, probably won't back an intervention in what they will see as a civil war. Should the outside world be trying to play a bigger role? And Ethiopian politics is notoriously complicated.
Absolutely. It is incredibly complex. I mean, we are now talking about an internationalized conflict in the sense that Eritrean forces have been part of this conflict since the very beginning. We have repeatedly called on the UN Security Council and notably the African group members there to put Ethiopia on the agenda. And I think this is relevant regardless of the outcomes of the talks. If anything, more so if there is some sort of agreement. It's going to be key that African member states and international actors put robust measures in place to ensure that if there is a cessation of hostilities, if there are commitments made in terms of assistance, access to assistance, restoration of basic services, that these are going to be monitored. And there needs to be eyes from the whole international community on what the warring parties are doing on the ground. And so I think it is absolutely essential that the African Union, but also the UN Security Council, is willing to put robust measures and potentially punitive measures behind any decisions and discussions which happen in the next few days.
Laetitia, thank you very much indeed. I really appreciate it. Laetitia Bader is the Horn of Africa Director at Human Rights Watch. Well, we've been talking to you, Laetitia. A statement just come through now on the Agence France-Presse news agency suggesting that, in fact, Olusegun Obasanjo is going to give a briefing on the Tigray talks in the next few minutes, literally 1600 hours. That's 4 o'clock our time. So in a few minutes or so, we are going to try and bring that to you.